Okay, ready to go? Let's rock and roll. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Kremlin File. And we're welcoming today Alina Polyakova. She is the president and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA, as well as adjunct professor of European Studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And today we're focusing on the transatlantic relationship and also, of course, the Russian war, on Ukraine. Hello, Alina.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Hello. Alina, my first question to you, today, is that I looked through, I ran across one of your Twitter, threads, and it was really interesting because it was on some observations that you made when you came back from Europe, And I'd like you to tell us about the differences between, let's say, how the war is perceived, in Europe, and maybe some of the changes, and how about the American side, having been on both sides of the Atlantic?
Thanks so much for that question, Monique. I mean, I was, really struck by how close the war feels in Europe. And of course, the obvious reason for that is that there are millions and millions of Ukrainians who are pouring into Europe as refugees as a result of this incredibly brutal war that Russia has launched in Ukraine. And so there were Ukrainian flags everywhere. People were hosting or even driving to the border. I heard about in Poland to pick up people, just, volunteering.
Yeah.
So, and in some way, I realized that we're all Ukrainians now. But in a way that is very real to a lot of Europeans because they often have roots, or they have friends who have roots, or they know people from the region because, of course, Ukrainians have been working in all kinds of service industries for a long time in Europe, like especially in Italy and France and countries that need that have a shortage of these kinds of workers. And so it just feels so much closer than it does in the United States, where I think here, still for the most part, most Americans, I think, experience in a visceral way the effects of the war primarily through concerns about rising energy costs and how much is it going to cost to fill up your tank, right? And this is what you hear President Biden talk a lot about because the U.S. administration understands that the pocketbook is the main concern of the American voter, but that really wasn't part of the conversation in European countries. And I have to say I was in the UK, which, is still not as affected. Obviously, the further west you go from Ukraine, the fewer refugees. But even there, it felt very, very real. And also because, the UK has this reputation for being the so-called, Londongrad, right? The joke there, that there's been so much Russian money that has ended up in London, that's ended up in the UK in properties. You hear Russian all over the place in London as well. And I think people became much more aware of that this is not like an innocent, benign thing, that the people who have spent so much money, invested so much, are supporters of the regime in one way or another, because you don't get that kind of wealth otherwise. And so people have become very, very aware of how geopolitics has affected their day-to-day lives in a real way. And I think the other thing is that, I found that the perspective, and again, most of my time was spent in the UK on this particular trip, was really much more, I think, realistic about what to expect. Meaning, I talked to a lot of people in the policy world, and the approach was much more assertive. People feel the pressure to be assertive in their response. And one thing that I heard someone say that I thought was really profound was, it's great that we have the Biden administration, which is a quote unquote normal administration compared to the last one. But
yes.
In a way, the US is acting like a European country, is what this one person I talked to said. And I think what he meant by that was
interesting.
Everyone's being very cooperative and polite, and diplomacy is back in action. Those are good things, but maybe that's not really the role of the US in the alliance with Europe. Because the role of the US is kind of to be out there and be more pushy and push Europeans in the right direction who will eventually slowly follow.
Yeah.
But we haven't been serving that role, according to some of the people I talk to, because they want us to be kind of the aggressive types. They expect that from us. But we've been a bit more polite, so to say, in how we're responding to Russia.
Yeah.
So those are some of the things I noticed from this trip. And frankly, I was really surprised. Like, I just put some stuff on Twitter like you do sometimes. And I was surprised that this resonated with people. I was like, wow, there are such profound differences across the Atlantic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's interesting because you have, you said how America is usually the pushy one. And we have seen Biden basically hand the reins over to Europe. And, hours after Putin launched his brutal assault on Ukraine, you saw it was Europeans who were the first one to announce sanctions. And like with every step, it seems to be Europeans are taking the lead. I'm sure Biden might be working behind the scenes, building coalitions, but it feels like he's given Europe that primary, upfront role with it.
Well, I will say that behind the scenes on the diplomatic side, the U.S. is playing a very key leadership role.
Okay.
Because, if we look back at sanctions policy in 2014, it was really hard to get Europeans on board. That we know Europe's problem, which is huge dependency on Russian gas and oil. And even now we're seeing that emerge. But getting the Europeans to be on board with the sanctions package that we were planning, remember at the beginning of this, we said, Putin, if you invade, the sanctions will be so crippling, you don't want to do that because we're trying to use that as a deterrent.
Yeah.
So we had negotiated the sanctions deal with the Europeans in advance. That whole process, I think, was very painful because many in Europe, of course, didn't believe the U.S. intelligence that Russia would invade. And so getting the Europeans on board with the sanctions that were then launched, that was very much U.S. leadership. But I think you're right that now we have seen Europe actually get a bit more assertive, at least on the sanctions side, though not as assertive as they could or should be, given how directly they're impacted. And the administration, I think, rightfully also sees that Europe in some ways on the economic side has a lot more leverage.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just in London, shutting down Londongrad, that's, leverage enough. Alina, knowing the level of the Russian economic and political capture in EU, are you happy with the level of unity that we've seen? And are you also happy with the sanctions package? Do you think there's more that can be done to make them more effective?
Well, look, I have some mixed feelings about the sanctions. One, certainly in some ways, there were more than I would have initially expected. It's also unprecedented to have this level of sanctions on financial institutions of a country as large as Russia, a country that is as globally interconnected as Russia. We've only done this level of sanctions on Iran, basically, or North Korea, maybe. Very different kinds of cases. The Russian economy is certainly not, a huge player on the world stage, but it's not insignificant either. It's not North Korea. It's also a nuclear superpower, right? So a lot of things we've done are going to have long-term crippling effects, and they're already having effects on Russians in Russia directly. But there's a but there, of course. Obviously, it's not changing Russia's military behavior. So sanctions have failed as a deterrent, which is how we initially thought the sanctions policy was going to go. And now they're failing to change behavior. And what that tells me is that it's just not enough. If this is going to be our primary tool that we think we can use to punish Russia and make them change their ways, well, 3 weeks into the invasion, it's not working. And so what that tells me is that...
Okay, what more would you do, Alina?
Well, look, I mean, I think it's true that the Europeans have absolutely have to take the pain on the energy side. I mean, that is Russia's pocketbook. And we're in this absurd situation where Europe is paying billions for Russian gas that is flowing, guess where, directly through Ukraine.
Yeah.
So there's an active war being fought on the very territory through which your energy flows are going through. And look, I understand you can't just switch from gas to renewables overnight. I get it. And I do think Europe is very aware of that. Even countries like Germany have done a huge turnaround in trying to reduce their dependence. And it's not going to happen overnight. But I think given the severity of the situation, suspend gas imports from Russia. I'm not saying forever, okay? Because I know Europe will have a hard time surviving on that in the short or medium term. But right now, it's just, it would hit them so hard and so fast.
Yeah.
It would really hurt.
Yeah.
And so, yes, I think there's a lot more we can do. And on the US side, you know, we don't have as much economic leverage, or we do have leverage over, because we just don't have a deep economic relationship with Russia. You know, our trade with Russia is very minimal. And we've already said we're not going to import any more oil from Russia. So we're kind of done with that, you know. But, you know, for a long time, since we've had sanctions on Russian individuals or companies or what have you, they've just found ways to get around those quite easily.
Unfortunately, yes, absolutely. Do you see any discussions of potentially cutting off oil supplies to Europe? Like, are they considering, as the images are getting, I mean, so hard to look at? I mean, what we're seeing happen, like, you know, Russia's discussing cleansing of cities that they are surrounding. I mean, is it hitting, you know, like Germany and other countries who are that dependent, like maybe?
If anything, Germany, because I know that Italy, for example, is already taking steps in terms of oil. They're going to be looking at other countries, and I know they're taking a very proactive. Draghi talked about it not too long ago. Gas is a little more difficult, but I know that they're working on the LNG that's going to be coming from the States and other things. But I don't know, Alina, do you know anything?
Yeah, you know, on the oil side, yes, that's a very active conversation that's happening right now. There might be a resolution to that or some announcements on that, I think, very shortly, because President Biden is heading to Europe. And I think they want to make some announcements on sanctions. And I'm hoping it's going to be this. I'm hoping it's going to be the oil. But oil's not really the big issue, it's the gas.
Okay.
You know, and on the gas, I haven't seen that on the table. And what's interesting is even in countries like Germany, which of course has traditionally been against touching energy at all, Russian energy imports, you know, public opinion is moving very, very quickly in the direction of saying no. But the policy isn't there yet. Because of course, German industry, like the beating heart of Germany, is going to be hit.
Yeah. They don't want to take the hit.
No.
They just don't want to take the hit. Let's be honest. I mean, I think that's the crux of it, right? It's the crux of it. Like, I know here that's the pushback that Draghi is getting from industries and, you know, that rely on that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Although, I mean, he's still going through with it. But I'm sure that in Germany, where their volumes are just, you know, it's the heart, the motor, the economic motor in Europe. One of them. France is up there, but France is energy sufficient, you know, self-sufficient. So it doesn't have these
problems. What I've heard in Germany,
thing.
Just very quickly on the energy issue, you know, yes, they made an announcement they're going to build 2 more, you know, LNG terminals to get liquefied natural gas from countries like the United States and elsewhere. But you can't build those overnight. That's going to take a while. These things take a while to build. So, but I think the one thing that Germany has done that's gotten itself into this ridiculous energy trap is they've phased out nuclear power, which France has not, to your point. And they on an accelerated path to phase out coal. Right. So energy has to come from somewhere. I think Germany is in a place now where they have to reconsider their nuclear policy when it comes to energy, because guess what? They're still importing nuclear energy from the Czech Republic. You know, so yes, in Germany, we're not going to have a nuclear power plant. We're just across the border. We'll take it.
Just across the border. They're right there. It won't make it. We're not going to be affected if something happens, right? Yeah. I mean, they shut down 3 of them. They had 6. They shut down 3, and I think they were going to shut down another 2 or something. You're right. They should be rethinking that. Let's move on to defense for a moment. Okay. And I wanted to ask you, let's say, in what areas and ways can we continue to aid Ukraine in terms of its defense? Like, how about also, how do we protect the delivery corridors, for those materials that are needed for Ukrainian defense?
Well, I mean, this is the big issue, of course, because I said, sanctions are our main policy; they're not working. But there's also the security assistance side, the military support. That's the other side of this. And here I think we have seen some very positive moves from European countries, from the United States, to provide direct military assistance at an incredibly rapid pace. But there's always a but. It's still not enough because Ukrainians are not able to defend themselves from Russian missile attacks, which is what the Russians are using now, primarily to destroy Ukrainian civilian infrastructures. And to be clear, they are explicitly targeting civilian infrastructure purposely, because they're trying to use civilians as hostages to force Ukraine to surrender. It's not working so far, but it's incredibly dangerous. I mean, they're just leveling whole cities at this point. And the Ukrainians can't do very much about it. They're intercepting as many as they can, but they have these anti-tank I think shoulder-held systems. They have other kind of quick-to-use shoulder-held systems, but they're short range or medium range. So what they need is more of the medium and long range capabilities. And there's different ways of doing that. It doesn't mean you have to have warplanes in Ukraine, because that's been on the discussion table and it's kind of stalled. But what about missile systems? There's been some rumor out there that the Turks might give their S-400s, which are Russian-made systems, to Ukrainians. I think this might be overreported because I don't see much movement there. But the U.S. obviously has these kinds of missile systems that they could easily provide to the Ukrainians, because what we're seeing now is Russia targeting exactly what you said, the supply routes. So yes, we're giving them all these weapons, but increasingly it's going to be very difficult to get them into Ukraine. And so I think we're hitting this question again on the cost benefit analysis, right? It's like, for Europe, what's going to cost you more in the long term to continue to house maybe over 10, maybe even 20 million refugees? I mean, Ukraine's a country over 45 million. As long as this war goes on, we're going to have more and more people. The costs of that are huge. Or the cost of taking the pain for cutting off gas, right? What's going to cost you more right now? And I think this is the same question with security assistance. What's going to cost us more? Supplying weapons that are going to get bombed out by Russian missiles, or taking the risk of saying we're going to secure these civilian corridors, because remember, weapons are going in on the same roads as civilians are coming out. So when Russians are bombing supply routes, they're also bombing civilian corridors, humanitarian corridors.
Yeah.
And I think we haven't been really willing to take that extra step, because we think if we do anything that's going to enforce some sort of control over the air in Ukraine, that's not by Ukrainians, it's direct confrontation with Russia. My response to that is, well, Putin has every reason to say that we're already in a direct confrontation. Because, I mean, what weapons are shooting down these planes? Who trained the Ukrainians on these weapons?
Yep. No, it's 100%, 100%. And I mean, and you see Russia saying the same exact thing. It's not, we don't have to imagine how they would feel, because they are threatening and saying that we are directly participating in these, attacks and as Russia puts it in their gaslighting, sociopathic ways, that we're supporting Nazis, which is a complete lie. We saw when Putin launched his war on Ukraine, we immediately, at the beginning, we saw the Transatlantic Alliance kind of shaky, and and it wasn't clear how everything was going to fall into place. Once Putin ordered the first strikes, we saw the unity, and it was such strong unity, probably not seen since post-World War II. Are you worried that as this war continues to drag on, that there will be, this unity will start kind of like fraying, and you're going to see more weaknesses between alliance members? Or do you think as long as, we continue to see the refugee crisis and the Putin, raising the stakes inside of Ukraine and targeting civilians and leveling cities, that the unity will only grow and, that we will be stronger as a bloc?
It's so hard to predict, right? Because certainly now, public opinion in Europe has been incredibly positive towards Ukraine. People are opening their homes to host people. There's Ukrainian solidarity everywhere. I mean, I get a little annoyed with it because I'm like, okay, well, that's great. You can let if you build these Ukrainian colors and hold, peace concerts.
Yeah, really nice.
But, give us
a tank.
Weapons,
Give us a tank.
Insane, right?
Give us weapons. I like the bunting. Give us.
It's kind of like thoughts and prayers when we need weapons. But okay, fine. If that's what gets people emotionally attached, I'm all for it. Because Ukrainians need global solidarity and support from just people, not just governments. I've been a little skeptical that this will last for a very long time, because I think, unfortunately, we have become desensitized to these conflicts. We just had Afghanistan. Before that, we had Aleppo, and then people just moved on. And so my fear is that there will come a moment when this is just a new reality, and we're all kind of adapted. That there's a raging war in Ukraine that may go on for years and may have hundreds of thousands of casualties and millions of refugees, and we just deal with it without actually addressing the core of the problem, which, by the way, was primarily the response with Syria.
Yeah.
Europe kind of saw the refugee crisis in 2015 from refugees from Syria as somehow disconnected from the war that was driving them to Europe. So it was always like, oh, the refugees are the problem. It's like, no, the Syrian regime is the problem. So this kind of strange disconnect between the source of the problem and the outcome of the problem. I'm afraid that this is where things are going to go. I hope I'm wrong about that. And the reason I might be wrong about that is because of what you said, that, Putin has been so brutal. And I mean, clearly for Europeans, this is much more close to home than anything that's happened in Syria. I mean, there's obviously a cultural affinity with Ukrainians, there's a religious affinity as well.
There is.
I mean, to say something obvious, I mean, Europe is largely white still, and Ukrainians are largely white. And so these are like people that are literally your neighbors. That's how many in Europe see them. So there is a qualitative difference there, for better or for worse, frankly. I wish there weren't these double standards around Muslims and people of color. But unfortunately, there are. And I think that explains a big reason for why we're seeing a much more open heart, open arms approach to Ukrainians. How long will that last? I think it's very hard to say. But I think as long as Putin's brutality remains what it is, and that I don't see changing.
No.
Because we've seen how brutal this regime is and how brutal it has been in the past. That may actually lead to longer solidarity and longer unity than we may see in the context of another conflict. So in a way, obviously Putin has made a horrible, horrible strategic mistake here. That if he keeps going on this path of destruction, I think it's not going to win him any favors, and it's going to just keep people more engaged with the conflict, because the images you see, they just become more and more horrifying.
Oh yeah, and people see it, Alina.
Yeah.
people see it. I know that here, for example, there are just a little something, when we get on to the next thing, that I wanted to sort of hook up with what you were saying about the source, okay, of the conflict itself and what we should do. But just as a little aside, here they try to paint there's a lot of disinformation, and they sort of want to push the narratives that Ukraine brought this on themselves, NATO, and all of this bullshit, right? That we keep hearing all the time. But I've seen, even with people, normal people, they're more than happy to help. They're actually, very proactive, and they understand. Okay, they simply understand what this war is all about. Even if, on the media, like, look, I'm looking at something here right now. They've got Dugan on Raitre, okay, which is absolutely, that's like, I'm just really angry right now, but let's skip over that, because I know we have better things to talk about than that asshole.
No, and people keep saying, I think Putin miscalculated, and I agree 100%. I also have to add, though, that I personally can say I'm as in much shock as Putin that people actually responded, because he has gone away with 20 years of atrocities.
With everything.
Chemical weapons on children, leveling cities in Grozny, assassinations with chemical weapons on foreign soil, assassination squads across Europe, every single election interference. I am beyond shocked, to see that. Like, I didn't think in my lifetime, honestly, I would see this kind of pushback. And within just 3 weeks, yachts being seized every day. I wake up and I'm like, oh, another yacht being seized.
Another one.
And so I think it's also that combination. We finally had enough. And you see what happens when the West unites for a good cause, how effective that is. And this is something I think I'm hoping, our alliances going forward, remember, because this is, it's just a perfect example of how all the mechanisms were in place and just got, immediately enacted. And you see already something, not a lot, but something happening.
Yeah. And also I'm hearing too, which is really quite disturbing, Alina. I don't know what you think of this, but I hear, like, on one side that Ukraine should be compromising, right, with Putin. That thing has come out. And then, to find a way so that you don't piss him off too much, kind of thing. A lot of Ukrainians, and rightly so, and this is my thing, is that, they shouldn't be conceding, right? And this is what's your opinion on this?
Well, honestly, I think, one, the Russians underestimated Ukrainians' desire to defend their homeland. That was probably the biggest strategic error. And we know the reason for that, which is, in a way, their own propaganda undermined their analysis, which is, if you think that Ukraine doesn't exist as a country, then why bother studying it? And so there has been little just understanding of Ukrainian society. And I truly believe that they thought that, at least in the primarily Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine, they would have sympathy. But what they were met with was just like hard resistance. And so I say that because I think that has hardened people so much, and the kind of casualties and brutality and the losses the Ukrainians have experienced has hardened them against any inch of compromise. And I say that because that's what I hear from Ukrainians on a daily basis. People who just left Mariupol, the southeastern city has been completely leveled at this point. People there are dying from starvation, dehydration, crazy stuff that in a country like Ukraine is truly unimaginable. It's a modern country. People who have just escaped, I've been listening to their comments and their interviews, and they get this question sometimes, well, do you think that Mariupol should surrender? They refuse to surrender. And the answer is always absolutely not. No one there that I know, speaking as one of these interviewees, will ever surrender, because people are so angry, understandably. And at this point, they'd rather die than give an inch. So if the Ukrainian government, comes up with some deal, which I don't think they will, because the Russians don't want to negotiate. They just want to put out these maximalist demands and ultimatums and have them be agreed to. But if for some reason there's some sort of deal that Ukrainian society doesn't agree with, the Ukrainian government knows they can't do it because they'll be overthrown. That's just the end of it.
Yeah. And then too, Alina, how can you trust the Russians again? Like tonight I was listening to Peskov, the Christian Amanpour's interview, and I just sat there and I said, how can we trust them?
How could we ever have trusted them?
Right, Olga? No, I know. Well, I don't even think it was trust. I think it was just money or business or whatever you want to call it.
I mean, with Russia, it's a very, known thing. Whatever they deny is the truth. Whatever they confirm is false. Any agreement they make is broken unless, it serves their advantage. I mean, with Russia, it's, this is how they've conducted business for decades, and even in Soviet days. Although I have to say the Soviet days, as horrific as the leadership was, I don't think they were this not unstable, but just ready. There were lines of communications and there were lines that were not crossed. Even we've spoken to CIA agents who operated in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And, and they said that the KGB agents, their job was to follow us, but they knew not to cross any lines. And there was this kind of almost kind of this honor between the two. You do your job, I do my job, that's it. And whereas with Putin's people, I mean, they're reckless and just they're, you see that they will cross all lines,
That's exactly right. And of course, they can't be trusted in any of these negotiations. I think the Ukrainians are pursuing them because, they're being killed.
They need to, sure.
And I think the Ukrainians are hoping that as the Russians see that their plans aren't working out, there are plans to take over all of Ukraine in a week was the original plan. That's not happening. We don't really know the exact losses, but some of the numbers reported are huge on the Russian side. Can't verify those, but I trust the independent reporters more than I trust the Russian government, obviously. So I think the Ukrainians are hoping that the Russians does this kind of a pain threshold for them too. And both sides are playing that game now. The Russians are saying, well, your pain threshold is if we're going to kill all the civilians in Mariupol, and then we're going to take this down, and then we're going to keep killing in a sense. And at some point you'll capitulate because your losses will be so huge. So that's kind of the stalemate that we find ourselves in right now. That both sides, are thinking that there's a pain threshold the other one just hasn't reached yet, and it will at some point. And look, that may be the case. Frankly, though, I think the way the Russian military operation is going has been a disaster from their perspective.
Oh, yeah.
Given that Russia has the second largest army military in the world.
On paper.
But
now we know it's on paper, was that, yeah.
Well, I think what we've learned is just how deep corruption has truly penetrated just Russian capacities and capabilities. I don't know if I've told this joke to you both before, but if I haven't, I'll tell it to the listeners. I heard this joke the other day when the war first began. That Putin gives the order to invade Ukraine, and Gerasimov, the equivalent of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the U.S. and the Russian side, meets with the defense minister Shoigu, and Shoigu says to him, "Well, but I already sold half the fuel." And Gerasimov says, "Well, I already sold half the fuel." And they both kind of look at each other. But we're but that joke, I think, just is so.
That's what we're seeing.
Yeah, no, it's perfect. That's what we're seeing.
Yeah, my mom has now taken to calling this whole situation the Wizard of Oz, because she's like, Putin is like,
Yeah.
here everybody was like so shook by one of the biggest militaries in the world. And, and now that you see them in theater, because this is, I don't remember, I think since Afghanistan, like Russia launching this type of invasion, because they've always taken pieces and they've always, so here you have them attempting to take a whole country and you see the military falling apart. And it's like, my mom is like, look, from all the propaganda and the corruption and everything, you see how everyone just had this complete different image. And you have American generals who are like sitting on CNN and like, what, this is the military? And
they can't believe it.
And she's like, and that's what it feels like. The Wizard of Oz, where you pull the curtain and you see a little shrimp with a microphone, just, barking.
But you know what? This is like the propaganda state. You know what I mean? It's sort of like they started building a propaganda army in a certain way, but I love that, Olga.
No,
I love that.
And we're seeing it on the battlefield. I mean, and it's just typical.
Yeah.
It's with the corruption. It's a typical thing in Russia, because even like I've seen pictures, like, friends send me pictures of a road, beautiful road, that someone got millions of dollars of contract, but then there's a tree. They didn't take the tree out. So the road comes to an end. I mean, and this is just, it goes to the corruption aspect that, Putin has created this state where everybody's just robbing it and depleting, the normal resources that are needed.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So the state reflects, right, the kind of leadership it has.
Yeah.
That's basically
it.
And
I mean, and what runs is the propaganda and brainwashing. There's nothing behind, that propaganda. You remove the propaganda and brainwashing, I think, a lot more, and people get deep.
Yeah, and I think it even goes maybe even one step deeper, because of the very dysfunctional kind of system of control where Putin really holds all the cards in Russia. The risk of going against him is so high, or disappointing him is so high. I mean, we're kind of back to like Stalinist era, right? With Putin, that, his own generals probably had to impress him. And, all these videos we've seen over the years that Putin likes to show, his generals show to him of these like, nuclear armed hypersonic missiles and all these boutique technologies that they have. I mean, he's been probably taken up by his own general's desire to please him by overstating their capacities and capabilities. And they do have some boutique capabilities, but what we are noticing is that they're not willing to use them here, either because they're not ready or because they only have a couple of them.
Maybe 2 or 3, exactly. That's what I think. Yeah.
No, people keep asking me constantly, like with this nuclear threat. And I said, I mean, I don't want to test it by any means, but I'm like, at the rate how everything else is corrupt, like Putin will press the button and the missile will go back into Siberia, because it's just, everything is so corrupt. And just even during COVID, we saw a total collapse of, the hospital system, and the pictures coming out of the hospitals, these hospitals in Moscow and St. Petersburg, looked like they were like just bombed in World War II and never fixed after that. And you saw rust and holes in walls. And I'm like, my God, like, how do people like just not push?
Investment in
nothing,
no investment in infrastructure.
No, the investment is in yachts, yachts and villas
they invested
in the West.
In yachts. That's what they did. Yep.
My question for you: we keep hearing people, and this actually we could cut out but I thought of it instead of the one I had. We keep hearing, everyone saying that we have to get information back inside of Russia. You are an information expert. What do you think the effect would be from that? Because I've seen like BBC is beginning, to go back to old Soviet Cold War tactics of trying to get information in using Tor and what is it called? Radio wave frequency. Yeah. And we see, other like methods being done. And now with technology, we see hacking yesterday. KP, the Russian media outlet, someone hacked it allegedly and, posted the real numbers, close to 10,000 American. Russian soldiers dead. And then we also saw, VK got hacked and they posted like over 12 million users the truth of what was happening, that civilian infrastructure in Ukraine was the target and the real losses being taken on the Russian side. Do you think that will have an effect, all these methods? And do you think this is an area we should pursue of getting information back inside of Russia so the Russians see what is happening?
I think this is such a interesting and also difficult question because we've actually struggled with this question for a long time, maybe before the war started. I think the challenge now, of course, is that the Russian government has de facto shut down all Western social media. And whatever they haven't shut down is coming. So, there's an iron curtain over Russia these days. And I think, we want to look back to the experience of the Cold War where the West did successfully get truthful information that was trusted by the Soviet citizens at the time. BBC Russian service, radio, Svobodna's radio, RFERL, radio, Freedom, Radio Liberty. All these kinds of sources were trusted more at a certain point than the Russian government sources. But I think we're in a very different reality now, where the scary thing is that a lot of Russians do trust the government sources. I always say that we can't trust opinion polls, but in authoritarian states, but those opinion polls are probably a measure of something. If, over 80% of Russians support the government's operation, so-called operation in Ukraine, they call it. Maybe it's below that, but it has to be the majority, I would think. And so the question is, can we really reach these people who've been brainwashed for 20 years and who don't believe their own relatives in Ukraine? Because, it's such
we hear that.
Two countries are so interconnected. And you hear these stories so often that people have relatives, close relatives calling them from Ukraine, from bomb shelters, and they don't believe that this is what's happening. And they don't believe the images when they do see them because they think it's all CGI or something, AI, whatever. It's it's fake, deep fakes, right? Of course they're not, because that technology is actually not that sophisticated.
No.
My own family, I know there's been discussions about this, right?
Wow.
My parents are very close friends. I'm from Kiev, and my mom says, I know these streets, I recognize these streets, and her close friends from Russia, and they say, who live in the US, by the way, who say, oh, well, the things you can do with technology these days, who knows? So people just...
it's that who knows. Yeah.
So I do think there are things we can do and that we should do. One, I'm very skeptical that the Cold War model will work because I don't think Western news outlets have the same level of trust that they used to during the Soviet period. So it's great that BBC is extending its Russia service again, but to what effect? I think the other thing that I would note, and we're starting to have conversations about this, over the last weeks, there have been hundreds of thousands, I think, of Russians that have left Russia because they don't want to live in this regime, they want to be part of this regime. Some portion of that, a significant one, are journalists and thinkers and writers and commentators, all these people who are probably going to get thrown in jail for their work. Yeah. And they're scattered all over the world now, like wherever they can find some couple of months on a visa or something like this. But these are also the people who are still connected to Russian society, who still have networks there, who have Telegram channels, and who are, many of them are prominent known entities from Dozh, the Russian independent TV channel that was shut down. People know them, but now they can't do their work. So I think one of the things we can do is to identify these people, support them, so they can still, message, provide information to the people that know them, that follow them, that trust them. Again, is that going to reach the brainwashed half of Russian society? Well, no, because I don't think they ever watched Dozh in the first place.
That's interesting. Speaking of Dozh, the founder of Dozh, and I was beyond shocked, she wrote, not that she wrote, but she wrote an open letter on appealing to Margarita Simonyan and what's her name, Zaharova, talking about Ukrainian mothers are burying their little kids in little caskets, and she cries. I mean, it was a very touching letter. She just fled Russia. What the shocking part is that Novaya Gazeta published it, and they had it as the front news. Their headline, like their disclaimer says we had to change all the headlines to remove the word war, and it's a special operation. But interestingly, they still, kind of work around, and they published this open letter, and this open letter was extremely, detailed of what was happening in Ukraine. And I was like, wow, this is definitely something, interesting. Yeah. How many people Novaya Gazeta will reach? We don't know.
We don't know.
That's exactly.
We don't know.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Alina, so much for coming on. And, and thank you for all the work you are doing and what CEPA is doing. And please, everyone, check out CEPA's website. We will have it on our episode because you have some of the best analysis and writing on covering everything happening in Ukraine, Russia, Europe, US. Thank you, Alina.
Thank you.
Thank you both. It was a real pleasure, truly.
Hey, everybody, if you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe and please visit our website, kremlinfile.com. This is a Bunker Crew Media production, hosted by Olga Lautman and me, Monique Camarra, with executive producers Marley Clements, Jack Bryan, Grant DeSimone, Ben Brett, and Jordy Mycelis of Midas Media, with associate producers Ruby Frankel and Sarah Metz. Theme music by Oreste Camarra. Sound editing and mixing by Joy Ellett. Subscribe to Kremlin File wherever you listen to podcasts. That way
I love the podcast.
Oh,
and thank you for everything you're doing to try to inform people about what's actually going on. And we just need more efforts like this. So thanks for everything you're doing, and I'm so happy that we can be part of it. Me personally, but also CEPA as an institution.
Yes.
So thank you so much for having me.
It's so funny because when we started it and I was doing interviews, it was like so unintentional, but it's like, all right, Edward Lucas, Ben Hodges, this one, that one. And I'm like, oh my God, they're all CEPA.